Welcome, friends of Private Universe. Today we have the long-awaited second part of my interview with Dr. John, Human Journeys. We talked about culture, literature, and travelling. Enjoy.
I'd like to look at that from the perspective of children who come from, or students who come from the Korean, Japanese, Chinese background, because let me illustrate it with this point. I was in a place called Pingyao where, as it happens, banking started in the world. It was the very first banking group of merchants that realised they had to develop a better system to trade right across China. So I went into a bookshop and they said, "Oh yeah, we have plenty of English language books. There they are over there." And so I went over to have a look. They're in German, they're in Spanish, they're in Portuguese. Nothing was in English. But from their perspective, it all looked like English because they were actual letters instead of characters that the Chinese were using. So it's just a huge leap for a Chinese student in particular, or a Japanese student using the same character system, to adjust to language in a place like Australia. So what advice can you give to those students struggling with language problems? How do they deal with that? What is the best way to find your own way through that that's really individual, because everyone is quite different?
Language is very important, as we know, and it's one of the things that differentiates us from other animals, of course, that we have a sophisticated language. Of course, there are many animals that communicate in different ways, and especially mammals, but birds, we know they communicate. We have a certain sophistication within our language that we can read poetry and make sense of it. Isn't that incredible? I mean, we have this love for the aesthetic, and therefore language becomes more than just a communication tool, but also it becomes a tool for understanding the world, understanding oneself, and for trying to come to make meaning of one's life. So that's why it's very difficult when one goes to another country, when you talk about people with different type of alphabets, like Japanese and Chinese. It would be extremely difficult to go to a place where when you read a sign, you don't understand the symbols. Unlike if you speak Spanish, you can read a sign and at least know that the symbol for A means A or A, which is only a phonetic difference, really. So I would, for those type of people, one is that I'm very happy that there are people, especially young people, and I commend them for having the courage to go to places that are very different to theirs, because that's exactly the type of people we require in the world, people that are adventurous, people that are broad-minded, and that embrace difference. Now, we also, having said that, we also have to understand and start from the basis that there is very little difference between people around the world. Genetically, there's hardly any difference between us, between different cultures, and the language is something that we grow up with. So if I was born in China, I'd be speaking Chinese, of course, and if I was born in the 12th century in France, I'd be speaking a certain type of French, maybe even Latin, who knows. But it's also situated in time, so that difference shouldn't be a problem to be able to relate to people, because it's only the codes that we use to interpret a situation or an object. So language really is, they're just code symbols. So rather, if we want to tell something to someone about a cow, it would be very difficult if we had to point to a cow every time we want to talk about a cow. So we invented the word cow. So it acts as a sign or a symbol for that object. And so we've got millions of words like that. Now, language, all it means is that they use different sounds for that same object. And so that shouldn't be a problem, because you can use other things. You can use your hands, you can point at things, you can draw things, and it shouldn't stop someone from being social. I would strongly recommend for people in that situation, especially young people, to not fear going out and talking to people, because remember, all you're doing is with language is exchanging symbols for things. And there's many other ways you can do it, especially with a smile. You're humble, you're open, you're happy. People will understand and will give you the time and will have the patience to be able to communicate with you if you carry yourself in the world with openness, humility, and broad-mindedness.
I'd like to ask you another question about the physical differences between the average European Australian and someone from China. I had an uncle who's unfortunately now passed away, who survived Auschwitz. He was in the Polish underground. He was captured in the uprising in Warsaw in 1944, and he was taken to the concentration camp. He survived somehow through strength of will and a lot of good luck. And he became a poultry vet, and he described a shed full of white chickens with one black chicken in it. And he philosophized that the white chickens ganged up on the black chicken, they killed it because it was different. And he believed that it's a natural part of being alive that people will differentiate between themselves and other people. Now, I know that people will try to make themselves feel more important by identifying with a group and pushing someone out of that group, saying, well, I'm part of this and you're not. I'm better than you. What do you think about that?
I think the human species has developed throughout the last few thousand years, and especially in the last couple of hundred years, where transport has allowed us to meet new people from different places. So there is definitely a sense of security when one's with people that are similar to us. But we have to remember what connects us. There are similarities that, for example, that could be physical, but if people have difference of opinion that may be political or religious or even social class, may be a bigger connection to people than race. You'll find that, especially research has been done in psychology, that people in high class feel much more connected because of their financial status than their race. So someone that's Chinese might feel more connected to somebody that's German or Polish, for example, in high class, than someone of their own kind, because maybe they're defending the same type of lifestyle. And so there are different ways of looking at similarity. I think definitely with regards to originally in the development of the Homo sapiens, I suspect, there would have been a certain security with having that tribal type mentality. As human beings started roaming and started looking for better places to live, they interacted more, and obviously now we have different mixes of races. So there is definitely no issue with mixing with races. On the contrary, we learn a lot from other people. People that fear that type of difference, especially racial, usually are people that have been quite limited themselves in traveling, in reading, in education, and maybe some influence from their parents. And it's not something that's going to help a person. We always say in psychology that it's far better off being broad-minded. Doesn't mean one has to accept someone else's belief or the way they live, but knowing they do that and the reasons why is far better than rejecting it or having a certain resentment towards difference.
So my interpretation of what you're saying is that we've moved away from that generation that believed in eugenics, which was a belief in a purity of races, a differentiation between races based on whether you're African, Jewish, German, an Aryan, or a Slav, or a subhuman, or a Untermensch. So it was interesting for me to listen to Egon, because my uncle, because he had seen the worst of that that thinking, that eugenic thinking, and somehow survived it, but still somehow believed there was a hierarchy of races, and it was a very natural process. Of course, from my understanding of what you've said, in Australia we're much more mixed. We're a very cosmopolitan society. We're a mixture of Chinese, Indian, European, Latin American people, so that we found a new way to differentiate ourselves, to make ourselves feel part of different groups by looking at how educated are we, by what do we read, how wealthy are we. We have a different social separation, a different stratification to that old thinking. So we're more likely to relate, as I understand you're saying, we're more likely to relate to someone with an equivalent level of education than someone from our own nationality who's uneducated. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And we've all been in that situation, of course, where we feel attracted, if you like, in a certain way to certain type of people. And it's got nothing to do with race, gender, education, religious belief, political belief, but there is sometimes just a generality of that person that we just like. And I think for all mammals especially, because we are mammals, it's very important to feel comfortable. Sometimes it's a bit of they call in the sports industry an X factor. That person may be totally different, yet we just click. It's like two pieces in a puzzle. And that is the beauty of studying psychology, I suppose, looking for things that we can't explain. That's the beauty of philosophy as well, and of art, because there's a certain mystery also to human nature, and we confront that on a daily basis sometimes when we feel that attraction to someone and we don't know why. Or also sometimes we feel a resentment or also an uncomfortability towards someone and we don't know why. And that's what we call going with our gut feeling. But to solely classify that within the race category, then I think we're falling into trouble, because we are becoming confused with regards to why we feel that way. So someone that's quite different physically, that's just an easy way for us to be able to say, I don't like them because they look like this. But usually, most of the time, it's not because of that. It's probably the reason why we do say that. It's because it's the most obvious thing, their looks, because they look like they're from a different culture. But when we don't get along with someone, or we dislike someone, or mutually, it's because of other reasons. It's because of personality. It's because of way of life. It's sometimes political and religious ideas come into play, but it shouldn't be an obstacle as long as both people respect each other's beliefs.
So we're now moving into an election cycle, federal and state, and from what I can see is where they're competing to reach the lowest point of thinking by not identifying people that are seeking asylum. So what advice do you have for people considering different voters, different politicians when they vote in the coming months?
Yeah, look, in Australia, especially for your students, they will find out very quickly that the immigration issue is an important issue politically. The problem with politics in Australia, like in many other places, is that it's represented by two major parties and they take turns governing. And so a lot of the time, the leaders of each party do say things that will get them more votes. Whether they, in the end, do it during their term, then that's something very different. I think with regards to immigration at the moment, it's a little bit heated because a lot of people have had bad experiences with immigration within where they live, and the media enjoy very much highlighting some of the bad aspects of immigration. And sure, like any other issue, we have to put things on a balance and say, look, this is roughly a good idea, but too much of this or too little of that may be detrimental to society. What we have to start off philosophically speaking, I think, and even anthropologically speaking, if you like, and geographically speaking, is that no one owns anything, really. You can become a citizen of a country, but we don't own the land. We're all on lease on this planet, really. And life is very short, and we leave way for other people. Patriotism is a very dangerous thing, and it's got us into trouble throughout history, as well as theological extremism. What we have to aim for is a moderate approach. Now, Australia is a very big piece of land. It's been occupied by tens of thousands of years from the peoples all around Australia, and they've managed to live quite comfortably and share, but also respect the place where they're living. Now, in modern society, of course, due to consumerism, we are taking a lot from the earth, and that is probably the most important question. Not so much not so much who uses that part of the earth, but how we're using it. I think is much more important than who, and that's something that our politicians in Australia have avoided for a very, very long time. Both big major parties. I'm very comfortable to sharing this piece of land that I'm leasing in my lifetime with anybody, really, as long as they respect me and my family, they respect my boundaries, and I do the same. And there is no reason why we can't have more people in this country sharing it in a civilized manner. But again, I will say, with regards to the political ideals, my ones at least, the big question is not who is sharing this country, but how we're using its resources.
So can you see any difference between a government that puts people, asylum seekers, into so-called detention centres, which are effectively concentration camps, and a president who wants to put a wall across the bottom end of his country to stop Latinos from getting in? Is there any difference between building a wall on the Mexican border and attacking children that have jumped overboard trying to escape from the Navy, rounding up asylum seekers? Is there any real difference in that from your perspective?
Well, I think morally, no. I think it's very similar, isn't it? When you look at a moral situation, it's very easy to judge once you're already on this land to say no more should come. But I'm sure there were people pre-1970 saying the same thing. And if they had succeeded, I wouldn't be here. My parents wouldn't be here. So I've heard a lot of people, especially people that already established migrants, having an anti-immigration type approach. But I think that's a little bit of a selfish standpoint, because they should have really taken that approach prior to them coming. But because it would have been counteractive to their own situation, then it's all right for others. So I think, morally speaking, it's always good to put ourselves in other people's shoes. It's very easy to judge from outside once we have already achieved or got what we wanted. That's why I think I always start, or try to, or attempt to start with, a moral standpoint is, okay, how would I feel if I were that person? Not from my perspective, because from my perspective, many things don't hurt me anymore. I'm 51 years old. I mean, I've already got my life established. I'm financially stable. I'm in a loving relationship. My children are well. Doesn't matter what governments do. My life isn't going to change much. I'm thinking more of future generations and a moral standpoint in a country. I want to live in a country that I feel proud to say, yep, these type of issues have been dealt with well. Not all of them, of course, because as we know, somebody or one political party isn't going to represent all our views that's in power, but at least most of them. With regards to immigration, putting up a wall or putting obstacles, it has to be in a manner where people understand exactly what's happening. No wall is going to stop people from migrating. We know that. People get around walls, and they also get around obstacles, and there's also corruption in many places. That's why, regardless of how big a wall is, drugs will always come into a country, and so will people escaping death, because if you are in a situation where your family is at risk, there's no wall that's going to stop you, because you're already in a way condemned. So it's either dying there or dying at sea. Now, us as people receiving this, we should have a much more humane approach. And if we have rules with regards to allowing people in the country, so be it. But they have to be very, very clear, and they have to be imposed in a way that we treat people or our own kind, our human beings, with dignity.
That was part 2 of Human Journeys. Stay tuned for part 3, which should be out at the end of April. Take care, my friends, especially during these difficult times. Bidding you farewell from Private Universe, of course, only for now. This is Carlos Camacho. And remember, existence is the miracle.